for us, we're wearing our, there you go. We are wearing our brave pants to be here today. So just out of respect for that, thank you so much. We are very excited to be here again, the second year for DID Awareness Day webinar. Welcome, 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 my friends. I will introduce everyone a little bit. We have Dr. Kathy Kelselman from Australia, who is a medical practitioner, mental health consumer advocate, president of Blue Knot Foundation with Australia's Centre of Excellence for Complex Trauma. Kathy worked in medical practice for 20 years, mostly as a GP. Under her stewardship, Blue Knot Foundation has grown from a peer support organization to a national center of excellence, combining a prominent consumer voice with that of researchers, academics, and clinicians advocating for socio-political trauma-informed change and informed responsiveness to complex trauma. She is a prominent voice in the media and at conferences, as well as author of a memoir chronicling her journey of recovery from child sexual abuse, Innocence Revisited, A Tale in Parts. She is co-author of multiple seminal Blue Knot Foundation documents and a range of other articles and publications. On Australia Day 2015, Kathy was awarded an AM for significant service to community health as supporter and advocate for survivors of child abuse. In 2020, Kathy was awarded the Pierre Genet Award by the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation. In 2021, Blue Knot Foundation, along with the Australian Childhood Foundation and the Healing Foundation, were selected to establish the National Center for Action on Child Sexual Abuse. Lexi is with Beauty After Bruises, and she is a trauma educator, survivor, outreach provider, and co-founder of Beauty After Bruises. As a survivor of highly complex trauma herself, she uses her lived experience of dissociative identity disorder, as well as navigating all levels of treatment, to inform her outreach and advise clinicians, survivors, and everyone with Beauty After Bruises. Due to the nature of her trauma story, much of her personal credentials and life identifiers maintain a level of anonymity, which has become a unique opportunity to demonstrate healthy boundaries and show one potential path concerned survivors can take in their passions. Including today, she will be off camera, but she is sitting with Anne. Lexi's main focus currently is creating clear, well-synthesized, heartfelt psychoeducation, writing articles, symptom management tools, and resource guides, designing social media and web materials, and most of all, bridging the gap between all extremes necessary for trauma care. Matching well-researched data with deep heart and connection, healthy realism with flourishing hope, and compassionate awareness with real, tangible, and effective change. Anne is the co-founder and survivor outreach liaison for the nonprofit organization Beauty After Bruises. Beauty After Bruises directly helps survivors with complex PTSD and dissociative disorders access the therapeutic and inpatient care they need. Beauty After Bruises provides financial grants as well as bridging the many gaps in trauma care by locating specialized clinicians, educating the public on trauma and dissociation, and giving survivors themselves the tools and self-compassion needed to fight another day. Anne received her BA from York College of Pennsylvania and built her career and businesses ownership in the health and human services industry. Her life was redirected by a loved one's close and intimate battle with complex trauma, and her focus transitioned into becoming an effective support person in their life. This required a robust crash course in trauma and dissociative disorders, the bureaucracy and financial demands of the healthcare industry, and society's mistreatment of survivors. This early introduction and life milestone birthed a passion to ensure the same services reach the countless survivors that did not have anyone in their corner to guide them through this maze. Thus, the Beauty After Bruises initiative was born. Today, Anne mainly works one-on-one with our survivors, their therapists, and doing public education. In every role, she offers the information, skills, and self-confidence needed to proceed with strength, self-agency, and the knowledge that someone has their back. Jamie is the founder and director of Infinite Mind, a national nonprofit dedicated to helping those living with dissociation and dissociative identities. She volunteers on several client-focused advisory panels and gives frequent presentations at conferences and universities. She lives in Central Florida, where she teaches preschool children with special needs and works part-time as an in-home early interventionist for special needs children aged birth to 3. She's also our head bee for Healing Together. Oh, and then me, that's us. Oh, wow, okay. I'm sorry. Okay, Emma Sunshaw, a pseudonym used for System Speak podcast, earned her BS in Human Development, her MS in Professional Counseling, and her PhD in Marriage and Family Therapy. She works as a licensed clinical counselor and as a community and hospital chaplain, as well as the role of ISSTD Professional Training Program Administrator. She serves on the ISSTD on the Annual Conference Committee, Communication and Marketing Committee, the DID Awareness Day Group, and the United Nations Work Group. She is a licensed clinical counselor, has been in private practice since 2004, with additional experience in ER triage, inpatient psychiatric, residential treatment, school-based, and outpatient settings. She's currently the International Clinical Coordinator for humanitarian aid organizations offering counseling and trauma resiliency training to government leaders, humanitarian aid workers, and first responders in war zones, refugee camps, and natural disaster sites. She lectures internationally about trauma and resiliency, and she's the voice behind System Speak, a podcast about dissociative identity disorder, which airs in 93 countries around the world thus far, with over 1 million listeners. Also, if you think System Speak is over, this sequel is System Speak Phase 2, Emerging Self. Besides numerous syndicated articles online about mental health issues, she is the author of Me, Not Me, and We, a lived experience workbook for phased recovery from complex and relational trauma with dissociative identity response, as well as the memoir, If Tears Were Prayers, A Life with Dissociative Identity Disorder, both of which are available on Amazon. And also the husband with Emma. So funny. He writes musicals. I don't have a paragraph on you on the page. I'm so sorry. So that is us, and we are here today to share with you about what it's like, not just with DID or our own stories, but answering some questions people have already sent in. And we are happy to talk about that. Also, I know lots of people want some of the links I've already mentioned, so I will be posting those as people share. So if we want to take turns doing introductions, just very, very briefly, Dr. Kesselman, do you want to start with that?
So, Kathy, yep, thank you. And that was quite an overwhelming introduction. It does feel like a reunion. Someone commented in the chat box. It's great to be back with everyone here today and to be talking about DID. So our organisation works with adults who've experienced all forms of violence, abuse, neglect, often from childhood, and many people experience dissociation on a continuum. Some obviously with dissociative disorders and DID. And we've worked very hard to try and build a level of understanding and acceptance in Australia around dissociation. And it hasn't always been an easy path, as it hasn't for anyone anywhere. And I suppose the main thing I'd like to stress is that with understanding and acceptance, and really elevating dissociation as such an amazing mechanism of the mind, we can really start to change perceptions and attitudes, both for obviously people experiencing it, just to promote self-compassion and understanding themselves, but also for people around, so that we can start to reduce the stigma and the myths and the misconceptions around DID. And I think that's why it's so important that we're doing a webinar like this.
Lexi and then Anne.
Okay, you first.
Lexi wants me to go first. So I'm just going to say hello to everyone. Welcome. We're really glad that you're here. This is so much fun to do this again a second time and to have a little bit of a focus on the support person that's helping someone with DID, because that is essential. I would encourage you, if you haven't already done so, to go back to the ISSTD's webinar from last year on DID Awareness Day and kind of learn a little bit more about each of the organizations. That way we don't have to fill you in on who we are and how we got here and all of those things. To save a good bit of time, because it's more fun to get to your questions and be able to really have that conversation. But we are a relatively new organization compared to both Blue Knot and Infinite Mind. And our main goal is really to kind of really bring everyone together, whether it's complex trauma or DID and everything in between, to help them find all the resources that they need, ranging from finding a skilled clinician to finding the funds that you need, to finding books and webinars, anything that you need. That's kind of our goal, is to help you find those things, make them accessible, make them easy to get to. And that's really my only role. I do not have lived experience with DID. I am the support person of individuals with DID. So I can speak a little bit more clearly on that subject than I can the lived experience side of things. But then, yeah, so I will introduce you all to Lexi, because she is really important in our organization. Without that person with lived experience, we wouldn't be able to do all the things that we do as well as we do them. So Lexi is to my left.
Hi. So I'm Lexi, and as Emma introduced me, I work with Beauty After Bruises in trauma education and survivor outreach and a lot of the media work that we do. As she also mentioned, we have a need to protect my visual anonymity because of my background. So though it's a bit unorthodox, we'll kind of get used to it, but know that I'm over here and that's just how it's going to be. And when it comes to the conversation focus for today, I thought it would be helpful to at least know a little bit as to like what I'm coming into the conversation with and what experience I bring to the table. I feel like it's something that I have pretty much every angle you could walk into it on, both from the survivor perspective as someone who's needed really high level intensive amounts of support, from somebody who wanted to keep myself completely private, and other times being very open and vocal and competent and comfortable with myself, from having really supportive loved ones to those who were really antagonistic and neglectful and unhelpful, but also as a peer to somebody else, to other folks with dissociative disorders, to really, really good friends or partners, or being their support system. Some of them being incredibly healthy and robust and my ride or dies that I still have today, and some others that were kind of unhealthy and our healing didn't mesh well together, or where they were at didn't click well. And that's okay. Sometimes that happens, and that's also okay. And now on a professional level, where I work with survivors in a charitable organization and meet survivors in their distress, where they are, help show them what safety looks like in another person, help educate them a little bit on what's going on for them, sometimes having to sort of predict what might be the most helpful response to them when they might not know for themselves yet. Of course, demonstrate what healthy boundaries can look like in that situation, especially when their needs surpass like my skill set or what I'm capable for. And just building trust and having that experience with somebody else. So I feel like before we quickly move on to everybody else, I feel like kind of my overarching thesis for probably a lot of this conversation will always call back to the fact that everyone is different, to communicate. And whenever in doubt, ask them what's best. Ask the person with a dissociative disorder what's best. Every survivor, every part within a dissociated system, and every supporter themselves comes into a relationship with very different needs, sensitivities, worldview, personal wants from the relationship, and power dynamics. So what we suggest for one person might be the antithesis of what someone else prefers, but only they can tell you that. So I imagine that most of our guidance tonight will pull from kind of the broader collective consensus that we've gathered from the community over the years. So hopefully we'll be able to lead you about 85% of the way. And then the other 15 are for you to explore individually and with the person in your life that you're trying to support or that is being supportive to you. That's my hope anyway. So I think that's good. And I think we're on to Jamie.
Let me make sure I mute. So my name is Jamie. Emma did a great job introducing who I was as a person and what I do in my career. And I am founder and director of An Infinite Mind, who most of you know or are familiar with. But for those who aren't, we are an education and advocacy organization, and we exist to make lives better for people living with dissociative disorders. Our biggest program that we have is our annual conference, and our slogan is, and our logo is bees. It's all bee themed, hence why if you're looking at the chat, there's a lot of bee references. It's all in reference to our conference, because all of the people that come, we call them our bees. And our conference this past year was hybrid, and we're looking at doing it hybrid again next year. So if you don't live close by or can't travel to Orlando, you're welcome to join us hybrid. This past year, I think we have 427 was our last count of attendees from all over the world. We had 13 countries represented. So just because you can't make it or don't live here, you're still welcome to join us virtually. We have all the bugs worked out, hopefully. And every month we offer a speaker series. So we have an expert that comes and talks about different topics, and it's live. It's similar to this, and it gives you the opportunity to have your questions answered directly from an expert in the field. And it's different topics that vary each month. Mainly, we just work to make lives better. We have a great resource list on our website, and we support and survivors and people living with DID and their supporters and their loved ones and clinicians any way that we can. That's all I got.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Jamie. My name is Emma. I go with the System Speak podcast, and the husband there who is with us this year, because our focus this year is also with partners of those who have DID. So I'm the one with lived experience, and he's the one living with the lived experience. So this time I will let him introduce us a little bit, and no pressure. What's it like, just to get things started? What's it like having the honor of living with someone who has lived experience?
I love living with my person who has lived experience. It has been full of surprises and discoveries for me, just as it has been for Emma. She has gone on sort of an amazing journey of therapy and self-understanding. Just since we've been married in the last few years, it's been amazing to watch how she's learned to understand herself and gain new tools. And so I did not know about DID before we got married. I did not really know about DID after we got married for several years. It turns out I'm just really not very observant. That's okay. But I have always been a fan of reading about psychology and understanding the human mind. And so it's really been, overall, I would say, a pretty easy adjustment for me. I just love all the parts of her, and that's how it goes.
You want to tell just a little bit of the story of us trying to tell you about DID?
Oh, sure. So when we first got married, she would say things like, just so you know, when I get home from work, I'm kind of in one headspace, and I need some time to transition before I'm ready to talk and do all those things. It's like, okay, we can do that. Didn't think anything of it. Later at one point, she said, "You're aware that we're dissociative, right?" I said, "I'm not sure I know what that means." She's like, "Well, it's just sort of when you're separating from bad things that have happened." And she'd always been very upfront about some of the trauma that happened in her past. But I just I wasn't the brightest bulb in the box. We were going through a drive-through once, and she's like, "You know, I mentioned dissociation. It's like how right now I'm eating a hamburger with onions and mustard, and usually I hate onions and mustard." It's like, okay. But eventually she had to like lay it out for me, which I really was grateful for. We went out to a Mexican restaurant so she could like give me all the news and write down some names of some of the major players that I'd be interacting with and how to identify them. But at the time I kept thinking, I feel like this should be somehow a scary new twist in our relationship, but it never ever was. It really wasn't. In part because I've always felt like all of these people are just parts of who she is. They're parts of her collective experience. And also because I've always felt like I recognize parts within myself, right? There's a part of me that is super creative, and a part of me that's playful, and a part of me that's serious, and a part of me that loves being a dad, and part of me that hates being a dad. Like, I recognize parts within myself. And so it's always just felt very logical, and it's just made sense. So I am here to support her and all of her in any way that I can. And that's just sort of been my journey.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing with us. Dr.
Do it.
Kezelman, do you want to speak at all what it's been like sort of being out, but in relationships around you and sharing that just a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose my experience was a bit different because it took me a long time to get my own head around what was going on. And what's motivated me a lot is that my medical training gave me absolutely no insight at all. And that a lot of my colleagues ran a mile because all of a sudden I was someone very different to the who I was meant to be. And so for me, that was an incredibly challenging, alienating, isolating time when I was terrified. I had no idea what was going on. I thought I was losing my mind. And as the different parts started to appear, and particularly when I started to talk in child parts, I had no context for that at all. And nor did my husband. And I certainly couldn't explain to him or share with him what was happening because I was too terrified trying to maintain myself at the same time. And so what would have been really useful then is if there was more general knowledge about this possibility and what it meant, and to try and put it in the perspective of almost normalizing is sort of a weird word to use here, but I think it is normalizing the fact that this was a brilliant survival mechanism that I as a child had used to stop my mind being completely flooded and overwhelmed. And it had sustained me and allowed me to function really quite well. But what, as I started to work through therapy, what I learned was that I actually had very little sense of myself. I had an identity as a doctor, but as soon as that dropped away, I really needed to struggle to understand who I was and to understand those different parts of myself. And gradually, as I could, then so I could start to engage my family, my children. But obviously that time was very scary for them because there was no one who could actually make sense of it for them because I was busy struggling just to maintain myself. And it was only afterwards when we could all sit back, reflect, and have, a lot of meaningful conversations that we could all understand it, make sense of it, put it in perspective, and build what are now much, much stronger relationships, emotional relationships, connections, sharing that I ever thought possible. So it's been a different journey, and one which has produced several therapists in my family, which is not surprising, and lots more understanding. So yeah, different journey, but so I'm very, very passionate about invoking tolerance, understanding, acceptance, because I just don't understand why people really struggled to get what dissociation is and what DID is, because to me, having lived that experience and now being able to reflect just makes so much sense.
Thank you. Lexi, what about you? Partners or relationships? What's that been like?
So I have possibly kind of almost the antithesis of an experience as Kathy, in that for me, learning that I was dissociative or that any of this was going on for me mental health wise happened incredibly young. I had been in a bit of a mental health system of sorts as a teenager, very young, and very quickly learned, I guess, comparatively, that I was dissociative and that I had DID. And that was similarly, though, incredibly overwhelming. I was what felt like at the time way too young to understand that, to follow that. And also still, because I was young, still living in a very unsafe, chaotic environment, still having access to trauma too often and for far too long. So though I intellectually could understand it and how that could come to be, my mind didn't really let me know much about my life. So it kind of made me a whole lot more wary of just about everyone in my life, every close person, family member, friend. I felt like there was so much going on that could be a threat that I just knew I wasn't going to know was a threat. And I think on the flip side, because I also was all but a kid, and had parents and family and loved ones, they all knew where I was in terms of treatment and kind of almost had to know what was going on with me. They kind of sometimes felt either lost themselves or almost like people were looking at them as if they were the problem. It created a lot of tension, and I didn't know if they were a problem, and they didn't know, and no one knew. And some members were worse about it than others. And it just created a really messy, perfect storm, all with the actual trauma included. So it was kind of really hard for a while. And then friends tried their best, but they were all very young too. And this was quite a long time ago. So education and stigma and all the things that we're trying to combat were really thick. And it was really hard to weed through that. And over time, after I kind of isolated and pulled myself away from people, it became a passion of mine to make it make more sense. A lot of the materials that existed were really dense in terms of just therapeutic language and not really accessible to the public, which just made it seem scarier and more intimidating and really didn't foster a very welcoming environment for understanding your loved ones. And so I kind of focused on that for a while, of how to bridge that gap, which then helped in my own personal life and my relationships. And then over time, as I got more acceptance of myself and better self-esteem and more safety and just knew my own worth and stuff and those kinds of things, in my relationships now, I kind of go into them with the understanding that this has to be on the table up front, not necessarily all out, super open. I still keep most things pretty close to my chest, but it's going to be out there. It's going to be an understood reality for me, especially also because my trauma experience has some physical ramifications for me. So those are they're kind of upfront for me, and I kind of have to explain a little bit. But how to do that in a non-threatening way, in a way that makes logical sense, in a way that is approachable and safe and competent and kind. I don't really have any tolerance for anyone who doesn't have tolerance, which is a good thing if I kind of lead with that. And I won't let anyone make me feel like garbage for it. But that's helped in learning good language and how to explain things, how to make it approachable. And that has gone quite a long way to making my relationships much, much better. But I empathize with those who don't have that ability, and that it would be much more difficult if I didn't have that ability. So that's kind of where I'm at the moment.
I think that is the quote of the night so far, Lexi. Thank you so much. Jamie, what do you want to share?
Well, I think it's important too to point out that the relationships and how you tell them and what expectations to have depends on who the relationship is as well. So when I was diagnosed, I did not know my now husband. We weren't even dating yet. So he wasn't one that I had the opportunity to tell. So the first people in my circle that I told were friends. And I think like Lexi had said too, that it's the way in which you explain that you have this is how I think it's received. And I just made sure that when I told my inner circle of friends that I was diagnosed with this and I'm trying to figure it out and I'm struggling with understanding what this means for me in my life and my career, it was presented in a positive way as much as I could present it positively. I didn't want to come into it as a victim mode that you have to come and rescue me as my friends. I didn't want to put that responsibility on them. I really wanted to come in it as a way of, hey, this is what I'm struggling with, and these are some ways that you can help, but I don't need you to fix this. I'm just trying to work through it, and kind of eliminated that responsibility from them. Then moving through, then the next level who I told was my family. And the way I told my family was probably not the greatest, but I said, hey, I made this website. I'm starting this organization. You might want to go check it out. It's easier that way. And all your questions will be on the website. And family's hard because, you know, we're still, now the organization's been around 15 years and it's still a very sore subject with my brothers and sisters because, you know, they feel like my story then is also their story. And by putting myself out there, I'm in essence putting our family and them out there. So it's caused a little bit of difficulties, and Wayne, and it's a struggle. It's still a struggle to this day. We've kind of hit a place where they won't deny or get on my case about it, but they also won't acknowledge and accept it either. It's like, we just don't talk about it. They just talk about Bruno. We don't talk about DID kind of a thing. Now with my husband, when I met him, I really loved him. Like, now I love him, but I love the connection. I felt like, okay, this is something that we're going to go. And I didn't want to risk getting heartbroken later down the line when I explained this giant, disorder that I had, that at the time I've only diagnosed 3 years at that point. And I was still trying to understand and process what that looked like and meant. And really wasn't, one of the reasons why we started the organization was back then there wasn't the resources there is now, other than the ISSTD and Sidran. There really wasn't anything, and those are really professionally geared. So there wasn't anything for people living with the disorder to look up and find and see possible outcomes and books to read that are going to show positive outcomes. Those weren't in existence. So on our very first date, I told my now husband, so obviously it worked out well. I told him that, hey, if you call me out for a second date, you just need to know this is what's going to be on the table. Like, I don't want to get heartbroken later. So here it is. I didn't go through like every system. We didn't do a roll call, but I was like, I have this thing called DID and I have a trauma background, and this is my website. Go read it and check it out. And just know that this is going to be something that we're going to have to work through as a couple together and over our relationship. And hey, he called me for a second date, and fast forward, we're married now. So it worked out well. So I think as far as relationships, it really matters on who the person is that you're giving the conversation to also. That's all I got.
Thank you, Jamie. I really appreciate these perspectives. I think there's so much that we share in common, and yet every story is so unique. For myself, I had been diagnosed early in college, but had sort of escaped that situation and avoided and dissociated from that. There was a lot of phobia there, had not followed through on therapy since getting diagnosed, just sort of ran away from that history. And so I was not diagnosed again until I was in my 30s, and both of my parents passed. And so that stirred up enough that it all kind of came to the surface. And at that point, I had met the husband, who we did not connect until we were 35, 36. So it wasn't like we were 18 and talking about DID. Like, we were kind of learning it together as older adults, and also trying to parent because we had foster children, all of this. And so that's how it kind of overlapped for me. I have tried a couple of times sharing with friends, and that has not gone well for me yet. But I think that has more to do with my choosing of friends and learning who is safe and who is not. So I am still working on that. Trust is very, very hard for me still. and attachment is very, very hard for me still. And so it is difficult for me to open up to people enough for that, which I know is ironic because of the podcast, but that is a specific thing. People who don't know anything about DID are not like looking that up and needing to know all my business. So it feels very separate. So in some ways I'm very out because of the podcast, or with ISSTD because of the podcast, or at Healing Together because of the podcast. But for me, those are safe-ish communities. I mean, we're all learning, but they're safe-ish communities in that context. I don't like run down to the neighbors and be like, hey, I have DID and these are all my people. Like, I don't even want to know my people yet. Okay, so we're making some progress, but it feels very safe. So I just want to balance that, because I know like DID Awareness Day, it's fantastic for fighting stigma and there's so much good about it, but also there's safety issues. It's always most important, and not everybody can come out about it, or not everybody can talk about it right away. And the same thing in your relationships. I've learned the hard way, pre the husband, that if your relationships aren't safe, you can't trust them with big pieces of yourself, and that safety is important first. So I really like what they shared about how you frame it and how you approach it and how you talk about it, but also I would apply the same thing with who you're talking to, and finding those safe people first. So we are going to get to some questions, if that's okay. Our first question was, how do you explain to interjects of abusers that they are not who they think they are? So first of all, I just want to, even without clarifying this question, say that that sounds like a therapy question to me. So maybe take it to your therapist, but also I would sort of normalize that by saying that it's the same as external people. Like, we can't explain to someone else who they are because we're arguing logic with experience. And so it's content versus process, which are different things. And so what we can do is work together at communicating about what needs those related behaviors are meeting, and how to meet those needs in ways that are more effective for the system as a whole. Do any of you want to add anything to that? Okay.
I had an experience with a particular part who was an interject. His name was Growly, and he was, well, the name would tells you what he was like. And the way, and I always wanted to leave Growly behind. I had, sessions where I'd talk to my therapist about, if you like Growly so much, you keep him over the weekend. But what she got me to do was embrace him. And to me, that was really aversive at first, the thought of, because he was the part of me that carried enormous shame and, had, done things which the perpetrators had done to me. And so obviously it took a long time for me to be able to do that, but that was quite remarkable over time when I was able to do that and, really understand what role that part of me had played, and it was a protective role. And so rather than wanting to throw him away, bring him into as part of the system. And obviously that was not an easy process, but it helped enormously over time. And ultimately he, pulled his head in, quietened down, and became part of, a cooperative system.
Thank you, Dr. Kesselman.
Lexi has something she'd like to say, if we can do that.
I was going to say, I also agree that that's probably a very good therapy question. But I think for both the person with DID as well as their supporters, I think with this one in general, education on what interjects are and sometimes often why they exist is sometimes the first step. The interject themselves might not know why. But I think, like Kathy mentioned, it is ultimately a protective mechanism. That's what most of all of our alters exist for, is usually for protection. And sometimes it just comes in a very backwards sort of way. It seems like they're causing harm, but are actually trying to keep you safer, which is antithetical and it seems kind of backwards. But if being the abuser and the loud and the angry one helps them feel strong and not helpless and like on equal playing field with scary things, why wouldn't that be preferable to a child? If harming the body or being threatening to other people makes them feel tall as opposed to small and meek and in a corner, again, why wouldn't that be preferable? If harming the body shuts down a therapy session because you've got to address the safety issue at hand, well, then we don't have to talk about scary things. We don't have to do the hard thing. We don't have to feel our feelings. We cut that off. And the same with even just saying threatening loud things in the mind. If I make everyone else in the mind feel small and scared and intimidated, well, then they're not going to talk to anybody. They won't share our story. They won't tell anybody what happened because maybe an abuser told us that if we did share, what terrible things were going to happen to us. So by me screaming at you, I made sure that you don't do that. And so now I don't feel threatened and scared and afraid of those consequences. And endless litany of other examples like that. And I think if you can help them, and even if supporters who might be scared of interjects kind of understand that, but within your own system, to ask those questions. What function is this serving? What are you scared of? What's going on? What are you actually trying to protect us from? Because I secretly believe that you're trying to protect us. Even though you think you're being big and scary, I secretly think you like us and you want us to do well. You just don't know that. And sometimes just those simple questions can actually like lend way to a really robust understanding of what's going on and an appreciation for what they've done all that time instead of this animosity and tension.
Thank you, Lexi. Our next question, how do you cope when your partner doesn't understand DID or support you? So that's a tricky one because anytime in a relationship when we don't feel understood or supported, that's called misattunement, which itself is kind of a relational trauma. So can also be triggering besides that. And our brains read that as danger. And we experience it as shame. And so we also feel helpless in that. And so it's kind of a downward spiral very quickly in that way. But recognizing what's happening in our brain helps us cope because then it makes sense and we understand it cognitively. Like our response is biological, it's neurobiological. It's not us doing something wrong or something we need to feel badly about. When we understand what's happening and why, we can feel more understood, even if it's with ourselves. And that can bring us back into our window of tolerance so that we function better or can make healthy decisions about and within our relationships and our environment. But it also goes to like what I was talking about, learning about healthy relationships. What does that look like? And who does that include or not? And what evidence is there that a relationship is safe or is not safe? And sometimes we learn that the hard way. With the podcast, we learn it very publicly. But you just, sometimes it just takes practice to learn that. Does anyone else want to add to that about feeling unsupported with a spouse or partner?
I suppose to acknowledge that there are times it can be very challenging to be supporting someone, with DID. And I suppose it's about what support they're getting, how they're informing themselves, how they're looking after themselves, but also for you to understand that, yes, that's your partner, but there are other potential people in your network. So how can you draw in other supports around you and help to build your own internal resources, like you were talking about, Emma? So yeah, I think, it's obviously very challenging not to feel supported, but it's a two-way street, and it takes time for your partner to feel comfortable with what you're going through, for them to get the support they need to be able to be there with you and for you. I suppose the message is patience for everyone, but
yes, I was going to say the same thing, Kathy. I'm glad you brought that up, that we have to make sure that the supporters are also supported, in that way too, because it's a lot sometimes to live and take care of someone who has dissociative identities. So sometimes the supporters need their own support. And so it's very important that they understand that it's okay for them to feel frustrated too. And it's okay for them to need to take a break from being a supporter. And it's okay that they have feelings. Because I think sometimes the supporters feel as though they don't really have the right to be sad or mad or angry or all these feelings because they weren't the one that had the trauma. They're not the one living with this. But it's okay too. You can have your feelings as well. And it's okay for you to feel frustrated with the situation and feel frustrated with what put me in this situation. And it's okay to feel frustrated and angry and sad and all those feelings, and you need a break too. I think you have to really do a lot of communication, as Lexi said earlier, that are you really not accepting me? Or are you having a hard time accepting the concept of dissociative identities? Or are you having a hard time accepting of what happened to me that created this to happen in the first place? I would think most of the time it isn't the challenge with the person. I think it's the challenge of not understanding what perhaps their particular role is and isn't as a supporter, and then also understanding who you are with without the disorder and what happened to you. And it's a lot for them to accept above and beyond just helping you heal. It's a lot.
As a support person, I can definitely say that it gets really, in your own mind, it becomes very messy very quickly because someone you love deeply is not well, and you don't know what to do, and they don't know what to do, and you don't know which direction to turn. You're not sure if you should be, if what you're doing is stepping on eggshells, or if you're causing more harm, or if you're causing good. You don't know what to say. You feel like you are in the middle of a bit of a tornado. And this could end up with everybody in trees, or this could end up with everybody safe and going, wow, we made it, but we don't know what it's going to be yet. And so it is important. Additionally, it's great to have communication, but let's be really honest, when we're talking about someone who has DID, they don't always have the best communication yet because they're still learning their own way. That's why DID kind of develops, because they were growing up in a situation where communication was its own mess. And so we've got different parts who all communicate differently, all experience things differently. So it's really hard for the survivor to explain what they need, but it's also hard for the supporter to know, how can I support you if I don't know what you need? And it is tricky. So it's important to just keep having the conversations. Today, this might work, but tomorrow we might discover that something else works better. And so we hang in there and we learn what we can. And today there is a whole lot more information available than there was 15 years ago. You know, when Kathy and Jamie were looking at this for the first time, there was nothing available. So thankfully, there's a little bit available now that you can kind of tune in on and know what to do and where to go, and not be so afraid. And in fact, actually be kind of excited about the journey, because that's what it is. It's a journey, and it's going to be okay.
Another thing I would add to what she just shared is that to remember a lot of early developmental trauma is also relational trauma, and not always, but often is also relational trauma. And something that can happen with relational trauma, we usually talk about in the context of therapy, like transference and countertransference, but it can come up in other relationships too, where sort of you're actually experiencing what they felt like at the time. So sometimes you just need those boundaries of a self-check of, is this stuff that I'm stirred up about, is that mine or is it theirs? And if it's yours, take care of yourself and what you need. If it's theirs, it's okay to set those boundaries and let them keep working about it in therapy or where they need that help. Like, it's okay for both you and your partner to be human, DID aside. That's just okay. It's just okay. Our next question: how do you quiet your head when everyone inside is all rallied up? I love this one. It can be so hard. So the most immediate thing I would say is do all the things. The things that you know: grounding, coping skills, meditation, or whatever, mindful movement, these kinds of things. We have a lot of those kinds of exercises in our workbook. Coping skills, there's a whole section in our workbook about coping skills. But also with that, I would add, don't do what doesn't help you. What helps somebody else may not help you. And there are actually some of those activities that are dissociative in nature. And so like if meditation is not working for you, it's okay to stop trying so hard because it can make dissociation worse. So like use those kinds of things as tools, but learn and practice what works for you and what doesn't, as well as talking about therapy, like pacing things and make sure everyone is feeling safe. And what can you do when we talk about attunement, even with ourselves? What can you do to tend to those parts or self states? Does anyone else want to add that or answer questions about how you settle things down inside? Okay.
No, I'm sorry. I was unmuting. Sorry, I need to raise my hand or something. What I find for me, and now I have to preface it with I've been in a lot of therapy. So, you know, now is different than then. But even still now, after a lot of therapy, what I notice for me is that when my brain starts getting really riled up, it's because I'm not paying attention to them or what they need. So it could be something as simple as they don't like that I'm ordering this hamburger because they really want to have, you know, the chicken. So I know restaurants are the worst. They're the worst. Restaurants and ice cream shops are the worst. So, you know, sometimes I'll notice that, you know, will make my head loud just because I'm not listening to what they want. I'm not respecting all their inputs or, you know, or whatnot. Or it's because they're threatened or they feel a danger and I'm not listening to that either. So I always find that I'm ignoring their cues and their warnings or their wants. And that's when my head gets super loud. And so I usually just take some time to go somewhere private, whether it's my car or the bathroom or just outside. And I'm like, what is it? Like, what? Like, just tell me. I'm going to give you all like a few minutes to tell me what it is, whether you're mad about it, didn't order what you wanted, or you're mad because, you know, or you're feeling nervous because, or you're feeling this because, and we kind of just talk about it and we come up with a solution that we can, well, we try and come up with a solution that everyone agrees on. Whether that happens all the time, no, but at least it calms it down because they feel heard and listened to, even if they don't necessarily like the answer. So I go with that.
I would just add to that there are times and situations where you just have to put someone or a group of someone's on pause. And I don't mean you're putting them on pause, but like if you're at your workplace, unless you're Jamie, who works with preschoolers, it may not be the time to let your littles out. You know, it may be. If you work at a preschool, that's a great way to navigate that. If you're if there's physical intimacy or sexual intimacy happening, that's not the time for little people to be participating. You know, whatever you need for safety and whatever you need for functioning is okay on a short-term basis. But part of that agreement with those parts of yourself is that you will tend to them. So when is it okay that the littles can come out? If you're going to say, let's go do this inside while I have to do this, or I'm in a webinar, so right now I need to have my self here. You know, then what are we going to do when the webinar is over? There's no telling, really, is the answer. But how are we going to tend to those parts and let out some of that tension and relax? You can't. It is more relational trauma, even just with yourself, to just leave them not tended to. That's the avoidance and that's the phobia and won't be helpful. And sometimes it's really simple. Like one of the best things for me, for my system, just to neurologically settle things down is going for a walk in nature. And so I try to do that every day just because I feel better. I'm not like a workout freakaholic or anything. I just feel better if I go for a walk every day. And trying to sleep, which I know is hard for a lot of us, and eat things that include nutrients. Again, I'm not talking about like a strict something about disordered eating or challenges there. I just mean in looking for nutrients. How can I add something that actually nourishes my body to what I'm intaking, right? Or mindful movement, whatever it is, caring for your body in that way helps your body function, which helps things settle down. Drinking enough water, for example. Is it normal to go complete?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, go keep going. Continue.
I'm sorry.
We're
next
just making
question-
sure you're on your game there, Emma.
I'm trying. Huh? I didn't know if it was inside or outside. There were voices coming. The next question, is it normal to go completely numb when I get overwhelmed? Well, I'm just going to say yes, that's dissociation. So next question, how do you explain to people what's going on in your head when you don't understand it yourself? That's valid, but it's also a good reason to be curious and learn about what's going on in your head. Both how does dissociation work? What is happening in the brain with dissociation? I know I personally carried a lot of shame, not just from trauma, but about having DID, until I learned how the brain works and what is happening and why that happens. And it just lifted so much shame from me, because my brain is not making mistakes. My brain is doing what it was designed to do. So that's just a powerful thing. But getting educated about what DID is, or dissociation, even if you don't have amnesia and you've got another dissociative disorder diagnosis, I just want to give them a shout out. Whatever is going on with you, learning about it either personally or generally, using workbooks, coming to things like Healing Together, getting resources, learning about it is a good way to understand it better, and then being able to present it in a way like what Jamie and Lexi were talking about earlier. You'll have anything to add to that?
I can, real quick. I was just going to add, in addition to self-education, I think it helps to reduce the pressure that you don't always have to understand everything. If you think like regular, single-minded, non-traumatized people often don't understand what's going on in their heads and their emotions either. It's not always simple, and not everyone is so introspective. And to reduce some of that pressure that you have to know and understand and explain it clearly can help make the space a little safer for you to explore, for you to talk it out. And sometimes in the act of talking it out, even if you don't understand it, to start with that and say, I don't really understand this. I can't really explain it. It seems a little wild to me, but this is what it feels like, or this is what it sounds like, or this is kind of what's happening in here. And sometimes the more you talk it out with another person who can sometimes reflect it back to you and go, this is what I'm hearing. And sometimes hearing it from another person makes it all the dots connect. Or similar with journaling and stuff. It's no different than like talking to a journal, but to another person. And sometimes they offer helpful feedback, actually, just by having an objective perspective. But you don't always have to know exactly, but on the more deeper things, I agree mostly with Emma there, in that education and understanding the logics of it can just help most things fall into place a whole lot faster, but reducing that pressure goes a long way.
Okay. Next question. Oh, this one is a little bit tough. Is it normal for your younger parts to still feel attached to one of your abusers? It's causing a lot of guilt and shame. So I would say that part of the issue is that they may have served a specific purpose. And so that may be the relationship that they have built, and that may be all they know right now. But instead of focusing on the scary parts, or I don't mean parts of self, I mean scary parts of story or narrative or experiences, the scary bits of what's going on in dynamics internally, focusing on the experience of the process, like what you're saying is guilt and shame. But that's interesting, because guilt is when we feel bad for something we did. But shame is when we feel bad for who we are. And that's a really important distinction. And neither of those apply to younger parts, because they were children. And they are not bad for what happened to them. And they are not bad for who they are. And so remembering that can help, but it also takes practice. I think it's also an attachment piece, that is hunger for attunement, waiting for care, doing what needs to be done to get that attention, or even fawning, which is a trauma response. But all of those are a trauma response. And I would say that it is the trauma that was bad, not the child or the part that was bad. Anyone else want to add to that?
No, I think, staying connected with the abuser makes total sense when you're a child and you've been dependent on the abuser for care, that you're going to stay, connected to them and then internalize it, when you've experienced extreme trauma as a result. So I think that makes total sense, but it's again about understanding that, forgiving the child, knowing the role the child's played in helping you to survive, and then honoring it, and celebrating them.
Anyone else? Okay. Our next question. When you're on a podcast, you can edit out all the ums. That doesn't work in a webinar. Our next question. Do you know the percentage of people with DID who are co-conscious with some or all of their parts? I think most have walls. Well, by nature of diagnosis, people with DID have significant amnesia. So I'm going to go with 100%. But there are also other dissociative disorders that may have similar experiences without the amnesia, and that's okay. Everyone experiences dissociation differently. But on percent and research, I don't have any of that in front of me. Anybody else?
Nope.
I think the walls are the amnesia, which is part of the diagnosis. So if we're talking about DID specific, then most of us, all of us, at least originally pre-treatment.
Yeah, I was going to say it depends on the, where you're up to in your journey. And I suppose that evolves over time. Co-consciousness develops between parts over time.
Well, and I think too, because we have to remember dissociation is a spectrum. And so also depends on where you are on the spectrum. So I started therapy. I knew I had parts. I just didn't know it was, I didn't know. I knew there was parts of me, and I knew that I was a we. I always talked in the plural. It wasn't a surprise that I had parts of self that were this fragmented and this separate. What was a surprise to me was that it was actually something. Like, I thought that's what life was, and that's how everybody lived. It wasn't until I started realizing that that wasn't how everybody else functioned that it occurred to me, like, oh wait, this isn't what it's supposed to be like. But so there were parts, of course, that I found later through therapy that I had no idea existed, that were more like behind amnesic walls and barriers, right? And like, right as we go, you're like, oh, look, who's this person? Or look, let's open this door. Oh, hello, 10 of you. But it wasn't a surprise that there was a we. I in all of my journals going even back to high school, I talked about them and wrote about them, and I knew their names and what they were. I just didn't understand what that meant. DID was never my, oh, that must be what that is. So I think also too, it depends on the spectrum of where you fall on the spectrum, I should say.
Our next question, how do you best be the support person when the dissociative behavior is very destructive? What do you do? The first thing I would say is simply that no diagnosis is an excuse for bad behavior, and safety always matters for everyone involved in a relationship, and consent is part of that as well. Anyone else want to add to that? Nathan, have we ever gone dangerous on you and you need to deal with it? I'm not seriously asking, I don't know.
No, I've never had that experience, actually.
Well, there's still time, buddy.
Don't get too comfortable.
Yeah, I've never had that experience either, but I do know I have several friends who have DID, and they have had, and it just requires making sure there's a safety plan in place, and that the supporter, whoever's around, knows who to call so that situation happens.
I guess I could add one more thought. I feel like that's the perfect spot to add an obligatory post note that the majority of folks with DID are not inherently violent nor dangerous. It's usually incredibly rare. If anything, we are far more likely to be the victims of more increased violence and danger. And if anything, also are more likely to be destructive towards ourselves. That's pretty common. I know most in this chat are probably aware of that, and most who will watch this are probably aware of that, but it felt like the perfect spot to put that in and keep that in the forefront of everyone's minds.
Yeah. And in fact, people learn to dissociate because they feel under threat. So it's a protection.
Right.
Yeah.
This is a good question. We got the question that as a carer or a support person, what's the best way to stay safe and not get triggered? So the husband, I will start with you. And before he answers, because I get to go first. No, is that again, I want to take the pathology out of it. I just want to normalize. So for example, he has depression. I'm not tattling on him. He's very open about this and talks about it on the podcast sometimes. And for me, that's a big trigger. I had a parent who was very, very depressed, and it can really trigger me, his depression. Like, I hate depression. I don't hate him. I don't hate my friends who have depression. I don't mean that. I just mean there's this very fierce, strong reaction when depression starts interfering in our functioning as a family. And so I think for me, I have to make sure that no matter what he's struggling or whether he's functioning or not, that I'm doing what I need to do to take care of me. And that's really hard sometimes because I want to think, if I just take care of it, it will be done better, or it'll be done right, or we'll get it all done or what. But we're humans. And then it's me like abusing myself instead of him burdening me with his illness. And so part of that is communication, part of that is boundaries, part of that is self-care. I don't know. What do you think about not getting triggered by my stuff?
I think it's exactly the same from my perspective, that that I have to be working on my own self and my own mental health, so that I am able to deal with whatever triggers and be aware that they're triggers and work with my own emotional self. Like there are plenty of times, someone in the chat was saying earlier about there are times that she has disagreement, I think it was with her son, issues with not all of the alters being on the same page and trying so hard to accommodate them and switching around. And with my relationship with Emma, that's not generally contentious, but there are certainly times where we're just not on the same page, and that can be really frustrating. And I know for me, I have to be humble enough and flexible enough just not to take it personally, because it's really not about me. So I have to make sure that her issues are not, I'm not thinking of them as about me, and I have to make sure that my issues, I'm not processing them as being about her, right? I have to take care of my own emotional health while she cares for hers, and then we can both be healthy enough to support each other in the way that we need.
And sometimes communication is just super direct. For me, that's an easy thing because I'm deaf. I don't know if you know that. I have cochlear implants. And so deaf culture is just very blunt. So usually when he's talking about how we communicate to get on the same page, usually it's me standing in the room going, I don't know what is happening right now. What is happening? And just needing to be caught up and on the same page. Or for him, it's getting like 3 sets of different bits of information about something, and those 3 not having the information he has already passed on at least twice. And so finding ways to work that out. Lexi or Anne or anybody else?
I know just from my own personal situation, you know, I may be quiet today, but I tend to be one of these ridiculously positive people, like the kind that are annoying.
Facts. There are no lies detected.
Yeah, so Lexi will attest to that, because I'm like, hey, everybody, it's a great day. We're gonna get wonderful things done today. Is everybody ready? And I'm like the cheerleader with way too much enthusiasm, the little puppy that everybody kind of wants to kick away after a while. And that can be, or at least it was for our loved one, really, like, could you just stop? I don't feel like, I don't want to hear any positive things today. I've got the shits of your voice. I don't want to hear it. And it was hard for me because I'm thinking, how could you not be moved by my wonderful presence and all these great things? And it wasn't moving them at all. It was actually making things worse. And then I had, so we kind of had to work together with, okay, I need to tone it down because I'm actually really annoying. But our loved one had to kind of learn to say, okay, but that's not because they're trying to be destructive to me. That's just who this person is. That's just one of their personality quirks, and I can't take it personally. So it did take some time to kind of get to where I could calm it down at least a notch or two, or know that this was not the day for that. This was not the time for me to walk in with that attitude, and to be really careful and not go overboard. So it really is a give and take, just like any relationship. It really is a give and take of, okay, where do you stand? Where do I stand? How do we meet in the middle so that we don't just kind of cause harm to one another that is completely unintentional?
And I can add on as another thought. I have to admit, I'll be entirely transparent. I may have dissociated when the question came up, and I kind of missed the beginning of it. But I think I caught on through the rest of things. But I guess what I would say is just two little thoughts here is that in general, communication between anybody, no matter what the issue is, or like sensitivities or reactivity to what each other has going on, is a concern for everyone. And trying to be as clear and communicative as possible is just always going to be necessary, but it's hard. It's hard for everyone. But I think for support folks who are having a really hard time, especially when every day it seems like the needs change, or the reactivity changes, or the sensitivity changes, I think understanding that sometimes like just two people are discordant and that they don't connect well that day, their communication needs don't mix well that day, but the person with a dissociative disorder, especially DID, has that, but also multiplied with everybody inside their mind, and sometimes they don't know, and it's not getting filtered through them very, very well. And so if it kind of comes out sideways or is kind of confused, it just some understood empathy for everyone to just go around. I know it's hard for you, it's hard for me, it's hard for everyone inside. Let's all just kind of be more loving and patient and understanding. But one of my favorite things that I've had, both as the person offering support and as who's offered me support, is when we get to these places where we're either kind of creating reactivity in each other, or we're not communicating well, is for them to very simply just ask at certain times, like, is this helping or hurting? And it's a simple phrase, and it's a simple thing, and it helps them feel like they're doing something appropriate, or gives them information, but also gives the survivor a chance to check in with themselves, because they might not know. Like, I don't know, I was just going through the motions. I thought it was fine, but now that you've asked me, I get a chance to check in with myself. I get a chance to check in with my system. I didn't know, and now I do, and now I can offer you an answer. And I didn't realize we were clashing this whole time because you were just making things worse, and I didn't know. I thought it was good. Or just a chance to also be assertive and then speak their needs. But it just offered a safe platform to do that, as opposed to just interjecting out of nowhere. This is hurting me. Like that usually isn't going to go over well for anyone. So a simple question, is this helping or hurting? It's a few words, and it's just a really good triage for a difficult situation. So that might be helpful to somebody.
Can I throw in just a random thought, because you made me think of something that a therapist told me one time as the caregiver. And I think it's really important. And that was that when our loved one looked like everything was great, like everything was wonderful and it's fine, and they're doing, and I wanted to say, things are so well right now, they're doing so great, you would be, it's just been life-changing. I don't know what they're doing in therapy, but boy, everything's really going well. It was actually the opposite. That when things looked like they were going well, that's when I should go, something isn't right here. This system is functioning too perfectly. They are doing everything they don't even know that they're not functioning. When things looked like all the wheels were falling off, all the emotions were being felt, they were being felt really big and maybe in the wrong direction, that's when things were going well, because they were working on what they needed to work on. And so it was really very helpful for me to hear that, to know that when our loved one looked like everything was great, I should be paying attention because something's wrong. So I hope that's really helpful for those of you who are caregivers out there to know if it looks like it's going right, take a break and step back, because something something isn't right. And maybe it's, a holiday and you're just going to get through it for the day, but let them know, hey, I know that things weren't good today and I just want to check in.
Ugh, thanks a lot for that. Thank you. Really, no, that's helpful to other people. No, I'm just kidding. That was deep. That's good stuff. Our next question, can you speak to how it became okay to be in a committed relationship? Oh, I would say that for us, it was not okay to be in a committed relationship for a long time. And then when we found this guy, it was a similar conversation as what Jamie shared, where we're like, we have to tell you all the things, or you don't even need to be talking to us because there's too much. And we didn't even know about DID yet at that time, those who were in charge at the time. Like, but all the things that we do know, you need to know up front because we are way too hard to deal with. And so we were very upfront about that. And he can share the story of our engagement, but what I will say about him is that he has never ever, this is 10 years this year, 10 years, he has never ever raised his voice at me. He has never ever hurt me in any way. He has never like, we don't fight. We have different opinions and we have disagreements as far as like, no, I want to do this, or I want to do this, or I don't know what's going on. But we talk about that. Like he said, it's not contentious. There's no reason to have like ugliness in your relationship. It does not have to be a hot part of you. It's okay to have safe and healthy interactions with other people. And so that's part of what made him safe. And there were parts of us, a lot of parts of us even, that were like, I don't even want a man. Like, just get them away. I don't need a man. I don't want a man. I'm not interested in a man. The children were talking a couple weeks ago. Sorry, guy. The children were talking about a couple of weeks ago, like, if you all die, are you going to get married again or no? And I said, like, if something happens, I think it's because we were talking about COVID or something awful. But if something happens to him, like, I can guarantee you, I am never, ever getting with another man. I have zero interest in getting with another man, but he is the kindest person on the planet that I've ever met. And that makes it safe for me as a companion, as someone to raise children with. And that's what made it okay with me and parts of me, even though we're not all sorted out or on the same page about a lot of things. I can guarantee you that your system is on the same page about being safe, even when safe feels dysregulating because you're not used to it. Anyone else want to speak to that?
Well, it was similar with me. Like, I just married my husband. We just hit over a year anniversary, and we thank you. We dated for 12 years before I committed to our relationship, because he was similar sounding to your husband. He was like this. He's like this always. He never raised his voice. Never. He was always kind. He was always compassionate, and he was always understanding. He was always this. And I was like, no, that doesn't exist, right? That doesn't exist. You are not real to me right now. So I kept waiting and waiting, like, okay, next, he's going to get more comfortable. Now I'm going to see the real him. And now the real him. And then all of my parts, of course, had to test him out and try, like, what would he do if this part says hello to him? And what's he going to do if we ask for this for our birthday? And what's he going to do if we say no to sex in the middle of something, right? Like, we all had to like do our own safety checks of what we needed to feel safe. And we all tested him. And of course he passed them all. But it took like all of these things before we got to a place even where we were like, okay, we feel safe enough with you and that we feel like you're ready to move in. And that was 2 years later that you can move into our home, and we lived together. And then it took another like 10 years before I was like, okay, now I feel like we can actually get married and be committed for the rest of our lives together. It's a process to get everyone to at least agree that this is a person who we want to spend our life with. Whether they love him the way I love him, you know, that's up for discussion. He can't hear me. He's downstairs.
We have several people both in question and answer and in the chat, and we just have a few minutes left, but does anyone want to speak about couples therapy? We've never had couples therapy like couples therapy, but I've dragged you to my therapy before. Do you want to say anything about that?
I always enjoy getting to go to therapy with you. I don't know. I feel like sometimes when I would go to therapy with you, it would force other parts out that not usually come out. Your therapist would always be like, "Oh, this is interesting." But yeah, I always enjoyed it, but it was always about, you know, how can I be supportive as opposed to these are the issues in our relationship we're trying to overcome. So it was different than couples therapy.
We kind of had an agreement as much as you can early on that we were going to make sure challenges were us against the challenges, not challenges between us. The universe has since tested that theory through a variety of circumstances. But because of that, again, it keeps that contention away because we've already agreed to be united. So our circumstances that are happening to us, and life is hard, that doesn't have to get between us because we're already on the same team. Lexi or Jamie or anybody?
No, I was.
I don't. Oh, go ahead.
No, sorry, I was gonna say I was the same. We never did couples therapy as a couple to work out differences. It was more like you had said, like we had gone to help him understand my therapy more and understand what DID really was and how my system worked and kind of see therapy in action and have an opportunity to talk to the therapist and ask questions or concerns that he might have had. And it was just a way to us, like you had said so beautifully, like to keep not the challenges between us, but work together to face our challenges together. That's pretty much what we did too.
I was just going to comment real quick. I've never experienced couples therapy, but I have been in relationships where we are both independently in therapy. I mean, I personally think pretty much everybody alive could benefit from therapy, but especially anybody who is a support person and anyone with really challenging mental health. It's really, really valuable. I also want to mention, though I've only had, well, initially there were some, of course, unsafe relationships, but only once I learned to really value myself and understand my worth and understand boundaries and understand what a healthy relationship looks like. Only then was I able to like accept people that were good for me back. And in those instances, I actually wasn't interested or looking, and I didn't really care because I was so content with being by myself. And but that's when the good people tend to find you when you're not looking. Those are the people who tend to cross your path the most. And those were very safe relationships, and they were taking care of themselves, and they were doing therapy, and they were making sure that their resources, that they had enough to, and that we were coming into challenges together. And if they had challenges, we did them together, and we weren't doing them against each other. I also just want to make a quick note that it is possible. I have also had long-term, very healthy relationships with other people who also have DID. And that's a little bit messy compared, it's difficult, and it's a little frowned upon depending on who you ask, but with the right person and with the right system set up in place and the right stability and structure, and especially communication, it can be done, and it can be done healthily. And the only reason we disillusioned was like timing and distance, and not because that was a challenge. If anything, it fostered a way much more fruitful need for communication and clarity and transparency. And that educational understanding was also there. We understood what was going on, and so we didn't have to clear that hurdle as well. Not advocating, not saying go out and do that, but I just felt like I should at least acknowledge that even that is possible. It's not some kiss of death. It's not some terrible thing that can't happen. It just has to be done carefully and mindfully.
Yeah, and I think to piggyback on that, it's a great point, is that I also do know that there are a lot of people whose supporters and loved ones and spouses have DID as well. So in some situations, you have a two couple relationship that's not really two couples, and that's a whole different dynamic, but it can be done as well if with the right policies and procedures and safeties and all that stuff in place, that you can have a successful relationship and a marriage with someone who also has DID too.
Yes.
I think in some ways that can be more powerful than anything. Connecting with others who truly understand you, but or your experience, or share those layers of lived experience. But I agree that it absolutely takes safety and healthy dynamics, meaning you really need to still be progressing in your own therapy and setting boundaries and healthy communication and all of those. This is very different than trauma bonding or trauma dumping or just making each other feel worse, but really focusing on healing and supporting each other and those safety things that bring healing. And I think that's part of why healing together is such a big deal. It's why people listen to the podcast. Nobody wants to listen to me talk that much. It's not about me. It's about finding someone who understands what you're going through and sharing that experience, right? So I really think that's wonderful. But it takes, like all the rest of our healing, it takes some practice and some wisdom, I think. And again, learning the hard way. The last question is for the husband. No pressure, and then other people can answer as well. But what else would you want other partners, for people with dissociative disorders or survivors, to know? This is a test.
Here, what do I want the other partners and caregivers to know?
Or people with DID, anybody. Do you have any information to share with the world?
I guess the thing that comes to mind, I don't even know if this is helpful, but it's the thing that came to mind, is once a long time ago, I heard love defined as a willingness to serve. And so my relationship with my wife cannot be about getting my own needs served. I need to have my own needs met, absolutely. But my love for her is not about self-satisfaction. It's about serving and caring for her. And that means accommodating, and it means being flexible, and it means forgiving when there are corners that bump into each other of she and me. And I think it's just a willingness to have a giving, generous perspective as a way of expressing your love for that person. It's in some ways, more complex than just a run-of-the-mill relationship, but also I think it's an amazing way to see the depths of a person. And so that's all I can think to say.
Anyone else have anything else to add? I think we'll just, my heart. So before we let you go, before we let all of yous go, we have a surprise for you, actually, in Nerd Town kind of way. And Bethany is going to share some news with us.
Thank you, Emma. And before we get to our exciting news, I do just want to say from ISSTD, and on a personal note, thank you so much, not only to all of you for attending, but also to this incredible panel of speakers. I say that this is my favorite ISSTD event that we do all year. And that's saying something, because we do a lot. So I just want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart to all of you. This is such a meaningful event that we get to do, such a meaningful conversation, and working with all of you is truly a great pleasure and an honor, and one of my favorite parts of my job. So on that note, with the incredible hard work of everyone on this call, as well as Kate McMaw, ISSTD, and these wonderful organizations are thrilled to launch a brand new support support sheet with helpful tips and tricks for supporting a loved one or a friend or family member who has dissociative identity disorder or experiences any kind of dissociative disorder. So that is going up on ISSTD's website. It will be out on social media as well. And then we will also post the link to that in the chat so that you guys can all access that PDF. This has been a lot of hard work from all of the people on this call. So thank you all so much for your participation and for contributing to this. It's a really beautiful piece, really beautiful document with a really wonderful community mindset. So again, thank you all so much for taking the time to be here. Thank you all for attending and taking time out of your day. And we will see you next year. And we just so appreciate, again, all of you. And thank you to the husband for joining us this year. A lovely addition. And just, again, thank you all and hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, night, whatever time it is, wherever you are.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot.